Hitler's invasion of Russia was the biggest invasion in history. It involved almost 4 million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and 500,000 horses. Their goal was to subjugate Russia, to bring it into the Nazi Empire. In hindsight, we know what happened. It was a disaster for Nazi Germany, the beginning of the end for Hitler. That said, it's impossible not to wonder, could it have gone differently? Did the Germans have a chance of winning, or were they doomed to failure from the start? Of course, the question depends on what changes we're imagining. What would have needed to be different in order for the Germans to end up winning? Would it be enough if they'd started the campaign earlier? Would it be enough if Hitler hadn't declared war on the USA? In this video, I'm going to argue that with a few key differences, the Germans would have had a very good chance of defeating Russia. I'll also discuss the crucial question of what does winning even mean? What would count as victory? However, before we go into all the things that might have happened, let's have a quick overview of what did happen, the astonishing story of Hitler's invasion of Russia.
I'd like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, MyHeritage. MyHeritage helps you research the history of your family and find information about your ancestors. They have all sorts of tools to help you do that. MyHeritage has a database of 20 billion historical records, including photos, census data, and birth or death certificates. This is how easy it was for me to find a photo of my great-great-grandmother, Catherine Sutherland. Given that the photo was taken around 1913, I never got to meet her, but it's still hugely interesting to know where some of my ancestors were and what they looked like over 100 years ago. I found out that almost all of my ancestors on my father's side were in Scotland. As you add people to your family tree, MyHeritage automatically matches them up with historical records or research that other users have done. For instance, when I put in the name of my great-great-grandfather, it automatically finds the record of him in the Scottish census of 1891. MyHeritage also has AI tools that allow you to enhance old photos and even colorize them. If you want to learn more about your ethnicity, MyHeritage offers a DNA testing service. Sign up for a 14-day free trial and enjoy all the amazing features MyHeritage has to offer.
In early 1941, Hitler dominated Europe. He ruled over an empire that stretched from the west of France to the middle of modern-day Poland. However, that wasn't enough. He wanted more. More than anything, he wanted to conquer the Soviet Union in the east. That was for several reasons. First, he wanted more land and resources for the German people. Conquering and occupying the Soviet Union would offer enormous amounts of natural resources and fertile farmland that would sustain a growing German population as it came to dominate the world. Second, Hitler hated the Soviets for ideological reasons. He viewed ethnic Russians as subhumans and viewed their extermination as a good in and of itself. When the Germans won, he was planning a genocide that would dwarf the Holocaust, killing potentially 100 million Russians. Hitler also hated communism, viewing it as a threat to his Nazi ideology. He believed that defeating the Soviet Union would be easy. After all, he'd defeated France in only 6 weeks. Defeating the subhuman Russians would surely be even easier. In his words, "We have only to kick the door in and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." On June the 22nd, 1941, the invasion commenced when the Nazis launched a huge surprise attack into Russia. From the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, German forces poured across the border. The Germans were initially astonishingly successful and made huge progress. Enormous numbers of Soviet troops were encircled and captured. By October, only 4 months into the invasion, the Germans had taken Kiev and were at the gates of Leningrad and Moscow, the two most important cities in Russia. All of modern-day Ukraine, Belarus and the Baltics were now in German hands. It was then that the German advance began to stall. In November and December, the brutal winter cold and ferocious Soviet defense slowed the German advance. The fighting had severely depleted their ranks and their supply lines were stretched to the limit. Soviet reinforcements, including fresh troops and equipment, arrived to bolster the defense of Moscow. Throughout the winter, the battle for Moscow raged and would prove a turning point in the war. The Russian winter took a huge toll on the German forces, who were incredibly ill-prepared for the extreme cold. At times, the temperature got down to minus 30 degrees. Men would have their fingers, eyelids, and genitals fall off due to frostbite. Then, in early 1941, the Russians launched a successful counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back from Moscow. Hitler then changed plan. Instead of trying to take Moscow again, he decided to send his forces south to take the oil fields in the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. That would prove a disaster. The German troops reached Stalingrad in August of 1942, and what ensued was 4 months of brutal urban warfare. Eventually, Soviet troops were able to encircle the Germans and annihilate the entire army. The Germans lost almost 1 million men and were forced to withdraw. From that point on, it was the Russians that were on the offensive for the rest of the war. Month by month, the Soviet army was getting bigger in size and better at fighting. Over the next 2 years, they gradually pushed the Germans back out of Eastern Europe and eventually all the way back to Berlin. So, that is what actually happened, a resounding defeat for Nazi Germany. However, my conjecture is that the Nazis could actually have won. Before we go any further, I want to discuss a bit about what would actually count as winning. Would it be enough to take Moscow, the capital? Would victory require that the Nazis take all of Russia, all the way to the Far East and the border with Japan? For me, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. I don't think that taking Moscow and holding it for a few months and then losing it to a counterattack would really count as winning. However, I do think that taking all of European Russia and then establishing some kind of client state would count as winning. For me, the Germans didn't have to directly control the entire area. I think establishing a puppet regime, such as Vichy France, would count as victory. I also don't think the Germans had to take all of Russia to declare victory. European Russia is where the vast majority of the population lives. It would have provided more than enough land and resources to fuel the growing German population. I am imagining that a Soviet rump state would continue to exist and potentially keep fighting. Therefore, the Germans would have needed to be able to defend their gains from Soviet attack. I think that could have been fairly doable. The Germans would have had the Ural Mountains to act as a barrier, making their puppet state easier to defend. Also, and perhaps most importantly, the Soviets would have lost an enormous amount of population, reducing their ability to recruit huge armies. Here is a map of population density in Russia in 1929. As you can see, the vast majority of people lived in the west. Here is the line of the Ural Mountains. If Germany had managed to take all the territory up to the Ural Mountains, the Soviet Union would have lost a staggering amount of its population, perhaps even the majority. It's worth remembering that the population of the Soviet Union at the time was 180 million people. If the Soviet government had had to move east of the Urals, it's impossible to know how many people it would have lost, but it seems to me that it could easily have been over 100 million. Of course, the Soviet Union would have tried to move people east, but it certainly wouldn't have been able to move everyone. If they were chaotically retreating beyond the mountains, it wouldn't have been possible to take tens of millions with them. That loss of population would have been an especially big problem for the Soviet Union because of the way it fought war. They relied on overwhelming numbers of men to defeat the enemy. Let's not forget that the Soviets lost far more men than the Germans. Some estimates put total Russian military losses at over 10 million. The Germans lost about 5 million, half as many. The Russians were able to do that because they had a population that was so much larger than Germany's. If the Soviets had had to retreat beyond the Urals and lost perhaps a half or 2/3 of their population, that fighting style wouldn't have been available to them. Some of you may think that for Germany to declare victory, it would need to take all of Russia in its entirety, and there's no doubt that that would have been extremely difficult. Perhaps if they conquered European Russia and set up a stable client state, it might have been possible to launch an offensive east a few years later. Another idea would be if the Germans had cooperated more with the Japanese, and that is a possibility that I will talk about later. With Germany attacking from the west and Japan attacking from the east, they really could potentially have wiped the Soviets off the map. Perhaps Russia would have been partitioned. Either way, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to count taking European Russia and setting up a stable puppet state as winning. So with all that context out the way, let's talk about some of the things that would have gone a long way towards helping Hitler win in Russia. There are 3 main ideas that I want to focus on. First, changes to how the initial invasion was executed, how they potentially could have taken Moscow. Second, how they could have had a huge amount of help from the people of Ukraine and the Baltics. And third, how they needed to avoid at all costs going to war with the USA. First, let's talk about the initial invasion. The German invasion of Russia began in June of 1941, and its initial success was absolutely astonishing. The Russians were completely caught by surprise. 40% of their bomber aircraft were destroyed on the ground within hours. The Germans moved incredibly fast, encircling and capturing millions of Russian men. Within less than a month, the Germans were about 2/3 of the way to Moscow, only 350 kilometers away. They had planned to deliver a quick and decisive blow, and it looked like that was exactly what they were doing. If they carried on the way they were going, they might be able to take Moscow in only 3 weeks. In my view, it was at that moment that they had their best chance of taking the capital. It was late July. The Russian winter was still months away. The Soviet army was performing extremely badly and was absolutely no match for the Germans. It was then that Hitler made the decision that I think may have cost him Moscow. He decided to pause the advance. The Germans had advanced so rapidly that they had left themselves vulnerable to counterattack. As they had advanced, they had encircled huge numbers of Soviet troops, but those troops hadn't been totally neutralized. Hitler decided that the army should do some mopping up to pacify the pockets of Soviet troops and secure its flanks. Most of his generals were against that and protested furiously. They wanted the drive on Moscow to continue. Some of the tanks were only 200 miles away. They thought that taking the capital would be a decisive blow to Russian morale and cause their resistance to collapse. Hitler ignored his generals. He overruled them and ordered that Ukraine be the priority. The advance on Moscow would have to wait. The Germans did have some astonishing success. Ukraine was taken and hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers taken prisoner. However, while the Germans had captured many men and huge amounts of territory, they had lost something even more important: time. The pause in the advance on Moscow cost the Germans about 2 months of the summer campaigning season. Winter was now 2 months closer. By the time they restarted their advance on the 30th of September, the Russians had had significant time to build up the defenses around the city. Perhaps most importantly, they had brought in a large number of reinforcements from the east. Those men were hardened soldiers. They were experienced and well equipped for winter combat. While the Russian position around Moscow had got more secure, the German army had degraded significantly. Its supply situation was getting extremely bad, and it had lost many soldiers. The Germans were also brutally affected by the cold. By the end of November, there were more German troops in hospitals with frostbite than with battle wounds. The Germans had assumed that Russia would fall in a matter of weeks, and so the army had done little preparation for winter fighting. Eventually, it became clear that the Germans weren't going to take Moscow in 1941. In my view, that first push into Russia was Germany's best chance of taking Moscow. That is for several reasons. In the summer of 1941, the German army was still in good condition, with a lot of good men and equipment. Given that the invasion was young, logistics wasn't such a pressing issue. The Russian army, by contrast, was at its least effective. It was badly equipped and led. By the end of 1941, that had changed significantly. The German army was exhausted. It had taken huge losses of men and materiel. The Russian army, by contrast, had grown stronger. Its commanders had got better, and it was actually better equipped. In fact, war production in Russia had actually been increasing, even as the war was raging. For example, Russia's production of its famous tank, the T-34, increased more than fivefold from 1940 to 1942. The Germans, on the other hand, were now having a real problem with logistics. The German plan for logistics had always been weak, not intended for a long, protracted war. They were using a combination of millions of horses and thousands of trucks that they had taken from France after they'd conquered it. In fact, about 80% of the German logistics vehicles were French. That meant that maintaining all those foreign vehicles was a nightmare for the Germans. Another reason that the summer of 1941 was the best opportunity was that Russia wasn't getting any support from Britain or the USA at that point. That changed in a big way in December of 1941 when the USA entered the war. I am going to talk a lot more about the role of the USA later, but for now I just want to point out that in those first few months of the invasion, Russia didn't have the support of the USA. It was effectively on its own. In my view, the Germans might have been able to take Moscow if they just carried on full steam ahead and not paused. Those 2 months cost them dearly. Even with the delay, they came very close. Some units were within 8 kilometers of the city. That said, even if they got to Moscow, there's no guarantee that they would have been able to take it. It was big urban battles where the Germans struggled most against the Russians. For example, the siege of Leningrad lasted 2.5 years and the Germans failed to take it. Stalingrad is another example, an enormous urban battle that the Germans were unable to win. On the other hand, the Germans did manage to take the city of Kiev in September of 1941, so clearly it wasn't totally impossible for them to win that type of battle. Another thing that might just have been enough to help the Germans take Moscow would have been starting earlier. The invasion began on the 22nd of June, that is almost halfway through the year. Given that the best time for them to be fighting was the summer, that dramatically reduced the time they had before winter kicked in. If they'd started in April or May, they would have had a few more precious weeks, which might just have made the difference. Given that Soviet war production was ramping up over time, it also would have meant that they would have met an opposition even less well prepared. That said, the Germans likely didn't attack sooner simply because they couldn't. They just weren't ready. According to historian Anthony Beevor, the Germans didn't invade sooner due to a delay in getting vehicles and fuel distributed properly, and problems setting up airfields in the east. So hopefully I've persuaded you that the Germans did have a chance of taking Moscow, which raises the question, what would have happened if they did? It goes without saying that we can't know for sure. I think it's very unlikely that the entire Soviet government would have totally crumbled. The state that Stalin had built was robust. That said, it would have been a devastating setback for the Russians. Moscow was a major rail hub. If it fell, communication and transport would have been much harder. That would have massively hampered the Russian war effort. The effect on morale would also have been enormous. To know that the capital had fallen would have been heartbreaking for the Russian soldiers. I think it may well have made a difference in some of the battles. There were some battles that lasted for years and the Russians were very close to losing. A good example was at Leningrad. That lasted for over 2 years and at times the Russians were close to defeat. I think it's definitely plausible that the blow to morale from losing Moscow could have tipped the balance. Now I want to talk about what might have been one of the biggest things that the Nazis did to hamper their war effort, one of the biggest unforced errors. That was to treat the people of Eastern Europe absolutely horrifically. Many of those people hated the Soviet Union and absolutely would have been up for collaborating with the Nazis. If they had done, the Nazis would have benefited enormously. Those populations could have provided men to fight and massively helped with logistics. In the end, because the Nazis treated them so badly, they remained hostile and bitterly resisted. When I say badly, I really mean with the horrific brutality that was characteristic of the Nazis. In total, they killed up to 11 million Eastern Europeans throughout the war. Now, there is an important distinction to be made between the way the Nazis treated Jews and how they treated non-Jewish Eastern Europeans. For the Nazis, killing Jews was the priority. It was urgent. Killing Eastern Europeans was desirable and was part of the overall Nazi plan, but it wasn't so urgent. It could happen more gradually. For that reason, the vast majority of the Jews that were killed by the Nazis were executed in extermination camps. The Jews would arrive at an extermination camp such as Auschwitz and immediately be sent to a gas chamber for execution. The majority of the non-Jewish Eastern Europeans actually died in slave labor camps. There they died of many different causes: starvation, disease, exposure, or overwork. In some camps, the majority of prisoners died within a few months of arrival. Those slave labor camps were in fact an important part of the German economy. At its peak, 20% of the German workforce was slave labor. The Nazis abducted 8 million Eastern Europeans to be used as forced labor. For example, by the end of the war, half of Belarus's population had either been killed or deported. The prisoners were forced to do all manner of different types of work, from quarrying to making rockets. For instance, at the Mauthausen concentration camp, prisoners were forced to work in the quarry, carrying heavy rocks up the stairs. In their severely weakened state, many soon died from overwork. About 100,000 people died there. While the slave labor camps were the main way that the Nazis killed Eastern Europeans, of course it wasn't the only way. Many people were executed by the Nazi secret police or killed by individual Nazi soldiers committing massacres when they captured territory. A good example was the massacre at Babin Yar. The Germans used some explosions at their headquarters in Kiev as a pretext to murder Jews in the city. About 34,000 Jews were executed over a period of 2 days. The victims were summoned to the site, forced to undress and shot. Of course, even those Eastern Europeans that weren't killed or abducted were treated extremely badly. The Germans would loot, rape, and commit low-level violence, all of which turned the local people against them. The Nazis didn't worry at all that turning those populations against them might hurt the war effort because they thought that the war would be over in a matter of weeks. They didn't consider for a moment that those people could be useful or even necessary in their war effort. In fact, they actually viewed the brutal treatment of those people as a good thing. They viewed Eastern Europeans as subhumans to be exterminated or used as slave labor. The long-term plan of the Nazis was actually to exterminate almost everyone in Eastern Europe. They planned to kill 2/3 of the population of Ukraine, with 1/3 being used as slave labor. Virtually the entire population of Poland was to be killed. The Nazis didn't manage to do that because they didn't have time, but it was the plan. All that brutality meant that those people hated the Nazis and bitterly resisted them, but that didn't have to be the case. I absolutely think that if the Nazis had treated them better, or even well, many people in those areas would have been willing to collaborate with them. The people of Ukraine were particularly ripe for winning over. There was enormous animosity towards Russia and Stalin, in large part due to horrific famine that had occurred only 8 years earlier. In 1932 and 33, up to 5 million Ukrainians starved to death in what has come to be known as the Holodomor. It is debated whether that was a deliberate policy by Stalin. However, what is certain is that it was a direct result of Soviet policies and that Stalin knew that millions of Ukrainians were dying and didn't care. The famine was absolutely horrific. All of Ukraine was affected and many people became so desperate that they turned to cannibalism. All that means that when the Nazis invaded in 1941, the people of Ukraine had huge animosity towards Russia, and it wouldn't have been hard for the Germans to win them over. We can see that at least some of the people of Ukraine would have been willing to cooperate with the Nazis from how the German soldiers were treated when they first invaded. Some Ukrainian peasants actually welcomed the Germans and gave them gifts of salt and bread. We can also see the Ukrainian animosity towards Russia from what happened when it was reconquered by the Russians towards the end of the war. Ukrainian nationalists that had been fighting the Nazis simply turned their guns on the Russians. They continued fighting for over a decade, long after World War II was officially over. They killed more than 30,000 Russian soldiers and police. The Soviets brutally cracked down on the rebels, killing hundreds of thousands of them. I think that the Nazis would have had to do very little to win those people over. Perhaps even just suggesting that they would get independence and refraining from the atrocities would have been enough. Obviously, the strategically intelligent thing to do would have been to actually treat those people well, to offer food and aid to win their support. Even if the Nazis wanted to go ahead with their genocidal plan, they would have been able to do so. They just would have had to wait until they won the war against Russia. So, hopefully I've persuaded you that the people of Eastern Europe could have been won over by the Nazis. Now I want to persuade you that that would have been of enormous benefit to the German war effort. Those nations could have helped in all sorts of ways. They could have provided men to fight. They could have provided assistance with logistics and advice on how to deal with things like the brutal winter. Simply not resisting would have helped the Germans enormously by freeing up resources to fight the Russians. Take Ukraine as an example. It had a population of 40 million people, which could have provided an enormous number of men to fight with the Germans. They could also have provided food and other supplies. Ukrainian industry could have produced weapons for the Germans. Logistics was an enormous problem for the Germans in Russia, so any help with supplies would have been incredibly valuable. We can see that there were people who would have been willing to fight for the Germans because some of them actually did. One example was the case of the Russian general, Andrei Vlasov. He was captured by the Germans, who asked him to form a collaborationist military unit. He agreed and formed what came to be known as the Russian Liberation Army that eventually grew to 50,000 men. It was made up almost entirely of Russian prisoners of war. Don't forget that those were Russian men willing to fight against the Russian government. I think it's almost certain that men from the Ukraine or the Baltics would have been even more willing to fight for the Germans. The Soviet regime had only come to power about 2 decades earlier. There were many people that were deeply hostile towards it. Vlasov, the leader of the collaborationist unit, wanted the Soviet government to be overthrown and a new government installed. Many people felt the same. Overall, not seeing how much those populations could have helped them was a huge error by the Nazis. It could have increased their chances against Russia enormously. Now I want to talk about what might be the biggest thing that would have helped the Germans in Russia, not ending up at war with the USA. To understand why that is such an enormous factor, you need to know just how much support the USA gave to the Soviet Union. It gave approximately 400,000 jeeps and trucks, 14,000 aeroplanes, 13,000 tanks, and 4.5 million tons of food. That food actually saved the Soviet Union from famine. There is a saying about World War II that it was fought with American equipment and Russian men. Hopefully, from those stats, you can see how true that is. The Russians themselves were also aware of how important the USA was. In private, Stalin said several times that if not for the USA, Russia would have lost. One of their most important generals, Georgy Zhukov, said essentially the same thing in his memoir. He wrote, "Today some say the Allies didn't really help us, but listen, one cannot deny that the Americans shipped over to us materiel without which we could not have equipped our armies or continued the war." Once Germany was at war with the USA, it's really hard to see how they ever could have won World War II. That's for three reasons. First, the industrial output of the USA was absolutely incomparable to any other nation. It was able to outproduce any adversary. Second, the USA is virtually impossible to invade. With enormous oceans on either side, there is no real way to get at it. Third, the USA was the first country to develop the nuclear bomb. Whichever country developed the nuclear bomb first was essentially guaranteed to win the war. So, keeping the USA out of the war was crucial to any chance of Germany winning, which begs the question, would it actually have been possible? Well, something that's very important to note is that it was actually Hitler that declared war on the USA. That was completely unnecessary. The USA declared war on Japan when it attacked Pearl Harbor, but since Germany wasn't involved, the two nations weren't immediately at war. Would the USA have entered the war eventually anyway? Well, very possibly, but potentially much later. It's important to remember that the USA didn't enter the war to save France, the country that had helped it win independence. It certainly wasn't going to be more sympathetic to communist Russia, a regime to which it was ideologically opposed. To many in the USA, Stalin's regime was evil, little better than the Nazis. That said, the USA was clearly tending towards joining Britain against Germany. It had been providing huge support, both financial and military. Not only that, American policy was actually to attack any German ships that were preventing American aid getting to Britain. If the Nazis were going to keep the USA out of the war, it would have taken a huge diplomatic effort. That said, for Germany, it would have been worth offering almost anything, since the USA was so important. One other idea that I'd like to propose is how the Germans could have benefited from cooperating more with Japan. Despite being allies on paper, there was virtually no effective cooperation between the two nations, no sharing of equipment or intelligence. The most obvious way that collaborating with Japan could have helped Germany was by invading Russia from both sides at the same time. A war on two fronts would have been almost impossible for Russia to deal with. When the Germans were close to Moscow in 1941, the Russians were only able to save it by bringing in men from the east. If Japan had been attacking at the same time, the Russians wouldn't have been able to do that, and Moscow may well have fallen. The Russians were only just able to beat the Germans, even with the war being a single front war. I think that if it were on two fronts, they really wouldn't have had a chance. That said, I must point out that cooperating more with Japan would actually come into conflict with one of the main points that I mentioned earlier, that the Germans had to keep the USA out of the war. The closer that the Germans and the Japanese were, the harder it would be for the Germans not to end up at war with the USA when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. What actually would have been better for both Germany and Japan would have been to cooperate closely in the war against Russia, and for Japan never to have attacked the USA. Then, defeating the Soviet Union would have been very achievable. So, how to sum up? We can, of course, never know how things might have played out differently if any particular thing was changed. That said, I think that had the Germans done a few things differently, they would have had a good chance of defeating the Soviet Union. If they'd done that, the scale of the genocide would have been absolutely unlike anything the world has ever seen. Thankfully, that didn't happen.
Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring today's video. Click the link in the description for a 14-day free trial and learn all about your family history.